Here in just a minute. Hey, Savannah, mute again. Oh.
Thank you for joining us today. The webinar will now begin with our first slide. Next slide. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the National Conference of State Legislatures and the Pew Charitable Trusts for this briefing on the Fiscal 50 Toolkit. My name is Savannah Gilmore, and I am a research analyst in the Fiscal Affairs Department at the National Conference of State Legislatures. As a reminder, if at any time during this webinar you have any difficulty hearing the audio through your computer speakers, please use your telephone to dial in to hear the audio portion. The National Conference of State Legislatures is pleased to partner with the Pew Charitable Trusts to bring you this webinar. Our next slide provides insight into NCSL's mission. In case you are not familiar with NCSL, we are a bipartisan organization that serves the legislators and staffs of the nation's 50 states, provides a number of different services, including research, testimony, and opportunities for lawmakers to exchange ideas on pressing state policy issues. One of those opportunities involves our standing committees, which are listed in the next slide. Fiscal topics fall within the jurisdiction of the NCSL Budgets and Revenue Standing Committee. The NCSL standing committees provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, as well as a framework for legislators to create formal public policy positions for NCSL. The committees meet twice a year at the NCSL Legislative Summit and the NCSL Capitol Forum. For more information on these meetings or NCSL's activities and services to legislators and legislative staff, please visit our website at www.ncsl.org. And now I will turn the webinar over to Ruth Mantell at Pew to begin.
Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. My name is Ruth Mantell, and I'm a research officer with the Fiscal 50 team at the Pew Charitable Trusts. In case you're not familiar with it, Pew is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that does research and advocacy in the public interest on a broad range of topics. Importantly, for today's discussion, we research state fiscal and economic issues. Today, you'll also be hearing from my colleagues Daniel Newman, Joe Fleming, and Jessica Karjas as we explain how to use Fiscal 50 to find out more about your state's strengths and its weaknesses when it comes to fiscal and economic trends. Our project director, Barbara Chavis, is also joining us today and can help answer questions after the presentation. If you visit pewtrust.org/fiscal50, this screen is what you will see. Our homepage lists all of the topics we cover and provides links to our data interactives. Fiscal 50 regularly publishes static and interactive graphics and analyses on a range of key fiscal and economic topics. Our indicators allow you to compare your state to itself, as well as other states and the country as a whole. Some indicators are updated as frequently as every quarter, and others once a year. But Fiscal 50 does more than simply plaster data onto a website. The indicators are designed to help you easily grasp an important insight, both in the graphics you see and in a short analysis that explains what you are seeing. Are you running a budget meeting with other fiscal planners? Show them a screenshot of Fiscal 50's tax revenue indicator to illustrate how much your state's collections have been growing. Looking for an easy way to highlight how much your state's rainy day funds have risen? Tweet or print out Fiscal 50's static graphics and let our pictures tell the story. Rather than exploring every single fiscal and economic barometer that's out there, Fiscal 50 carefully chooses indicators that provide key insights into states' fiscal health. We focus on tax revenue, Medicaid, employment, personal income, long-term costs, rainy day funds, and whether your state spending is on a sustainable path. One standout feature of Fiscal 50 is our focus on long-term trends, typically going back at least 10 years. Rather than placing too much emphasis on volatile year-to-year data, our chief aim is to provide users with an understanding of how a state is doing beyond its current budget. However, for a sense of recent change, we do also show annual trends in many of our indicators. Today, we will tour several of Fiscal 50's key indicators to look at some of the major trends that have brought states to where they are today. What you'll see is that while it's been 10 years since the Great Recession began, not all states have recovered fiscally or economically, and many face substantial challenges from long-term costs and other issues. Using data and graphics from Fiscal 50, we'll show you how to put your state's progress and its challenges into perspective. Today, we'll answer these questions. First, tax revenue growth. How well has state tax revenue rebounded since the Great Recession? Second, rainy day funds. 8 years into the recovery, how far along are states in rebuilding these funds that help provide a financial cushion? Third, economic growth. The U.S. is 1 month away from tying for the second largest expansion on record. Have states' economies fully recovered from the recession? Fourth, mandatory spending. How are long-term costs and Medicaid pressuring states' budgets? Fifth, fiscal balance. Are states spending more than they are taking in over the long run? Finally, we will end today's webinar with a live Q&A session. During that session, we'll also show you how to use the interactive in real time as we answer questions. And now I'm going to pass the microphone to Fiscal 50 researcher Daniel Newman, who will begin by speaking about states' tax revenue.
Thank you, Ruth. So tax dollars are the largest source of state government funding, making up almost half of all the money states use to fund operations in a given year. Fiscal 50's tax revenue indicator tracks how state tax collections have changed over time from the peak level they reached before dropping in the Great Recession. While we are currently in the 9th year of economic expansion, revenue growth has been exceptionally slow. As Ruth just mentioned, in all 3 previous recessions, which admittedly were not as deep, 50 state tax revenue in real terms had bounced back in just under 3 years or less. Yet this time, it took nearly 5 years for total tax revenue to recover. But that picture is different looking state by state. Along with the national recovery, collections in many states have surpassed the inflation-adjusted levels they recorded before the effects of the recession. But revenue in a number of states still lags below where it was before the downturn. The first thing you'll see in our tax revenue indicator is the 50-state trend shown here in blue. This traces how total state tax revenue for all 50 states has been performing over the last 11 years or so. Fiscal 50 looks at tax revenue by identifying when each state's tax revenue peaked just before or during the recession, and then we measure how tax collections have performed since then. Here you can see that tax revenue peaked nationally in the third quarter of 2008. Figures are adjusted for inflation, so you can think of this indicator as looking at how much each state's purchasing power has changed over time. Policy changes are also included, so trends reflect not only the economy, but also the decisions made by state policymakers. One thing I want you to notice is how steep the drop after the recession was. Collections fell 13% as most states took a big financial hit. Looking at the far right, you can see where revenue collections stood with the most recent data, marking the end of fiscal year 2017 for most states. At that point, states collectively were at 6.3% above peak. So another way to think about this is that they were taking in about 6.3 cents more for every dollar they took in at that peak point nearly 9 years earlier. And over this time, demand for state services wasn't standing still, of course. So this 6 cents of extra purchasing power is what states had available to cover any increases in population, such as those in the number of school-aged children, or Medicaid enrollment, or other needs that put additional strain on state budgets. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is the tail end of the blue line, really looking at the trends since mid-2015. That's when state tax revenue had its weakest two-year stretch of growth outside of a recession in at least 30 years. And this helps to explain why a number of states found it so difficult to balance their budgets over the past couple fiscal years, including for some states whose revenue has already rebounded from losses in the Great Recession. The Fiscal 50 indicator allows you to easily compare several states. So let's take a look at which state has had the largest recovery and which still lags the most. These are North Dakota, seen here in orange, and Alaska, seen here in green. Interestingly, Alaska and North Dakota both rely on revenue related to the oil industry for a significant portion of their budgets. However, they have followed very different paths since the Great Recession. North Dakota's tax revenue growth has been greater than any other state's, and it remains the leader despite the large decline you see following a 2014 drop in oil prices. In the latest data, its revenue collection stood around 26% above peak. At the other end of the spectrum, Alaska is the state furthest off from its recessionary peak. The state was about 88% below, meaning it collected only 12% as much in inflation-adjusted tax dollars as it did back in 2008. At that time, revenue was boosted by a new state oil tax and a period of record high crude prices. As you can see, tax revenue declines have tapered off recently in both these states, and that's in part because energy prices picked up somewhat. And that's not unique to these two states. Most other states that depend on fossil fuel production also show this. So you might be wondering about your state and the quickest way to see where it stands in the most recent data. For that, you can see our second indicator view showing a map with every state's latest result. Those in orange are still below the recessionary peak, while those in blue have surpassed it. Again, part of this is related to policy changes, but each state's economic performance also plays a role. As you can see, tax revenue growth has been quite uneven across states. As of the second quarter of 2017, there were 29 states here in blue taking in more tax dollars than their peak after adjusting for inflation. But in the 21 states shown here in orange, real tax revenue was still lower than it was at least 8 years ago. And these trends are important to keep in mind because they help you get a feel for where states stand as they face new uncertainties from federal income tax changes or future federal funding, and questions about how long this economic recovery will run. So it's important to remember that almost 10 years later now, the effects of the recession continue to be felt in many states, but it really matters where you live. And so speaking of being prepared for the next economic downturn, our next indicator today tracks states' reserves and balances. Fiscal 50 does this by looking at each state's reserves relative to its spending. This makes it easy to compare across states. Specifically, we track how many days a state could operate using only its dedicated rainy day funds. This is basically the same as measuring reserves as a percentage of state spending, just expressed in days rather than percentages. We also track total balances, which includes the rainy day fund plus any money in a state's general fund ending balance. But today, we will just highlight figures from rainy day funds. It's important to remember here that different size budgets need different size financial cushions. So this is not meant to suggest that one size fits all states when it comes to reserves. Here in this chart, the blue line is the 50-state median. So half of states were above this line in any given year and half below. After the two most recent recessions, which are shaded out in gray, you can see that the line drops as state governments relied heavily on the reserves to help absorb some of the revenue shock. As the line rises, you can also see states using the economic recovery after each recession to rebuild their financial cushions. The good news here is that by the end of fiscal 2017, which was the most recent 50-state data available, the median amount held by states was higher than in 2007, which was the last full year before the recession hit. The bad news is that means nearly half the state's rainy day funds still had not been replenished to their pre-recession level. And it's important to keep in mind that pre-recession reserves in many states weren't enough to cover the revenue losses caused by the Great Recession. The reserves indicator also shows how each state managed its reserves over the past two recessions. One state that's made strides in bolstering its savings is Georgia, which you can see in orange. It now holds more days worth of spending than at any point since at least 2000. In contrast, Massachusetts in green has struggled to build up for the next recession. Despite the long and strong economic recovery, the state still holds less as a share of spending than it did before both of the last two recessions. And partially as a consequence of this, S&P Global Ratings downgraded Massachusetts' debt rating last year, citing its failure to follow through on rebuilding its reserves. The last thing I want to show you on rainy day funds is this map. The numbers for each state show how many days worth of savings each had at the end of fiscal year 2017. And the colors show whether that amount was more or less than they held back in 2007 before the recession hit. So blue states held more and orange fewer. 26 states, so just over half, are in blue and have more than they did 10 years ago. Those with the most are Alaska and Wyoming, which both ended last fiscal year with over a year's worth of spending in their rainy day accounts. At the bottom, 4 states had 0 days worth of spending: Kansas, Montana, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Kansas and Montana both created their funds in fiscal 2017, but have not yet made deposits. But New Jersey and Pennsylvania both drained their rainy day funds after the recession and have struggled to refill them since then. So this indicator is a good way to check up on your state savings and see how it compares to others. With the wide range of savings you see here, it's easy to understand that some states are going to be more prepared for the next recession than others. Now I'm going to pass the presentation to our associate, Joe Fleming, who will introduce one of our economic indicators and then move on to states' long-term costs.
Thanks, Danny. So the most important driver of the tax revenue and reserve trends you've just seen is the economy. To measure the economy, Fiscal 50 looks at state personal income, which includes all income residents receive, ranging from paychecks to Social Security, rent, and other sources. The good news here is that the economic recovery from the recession is widespread. Personal income in each state has risen above pre-recession levels after dropping during the downturn. But don't get too excited. Since the start of the recession at the end of 2007, U.S. personal income has grown the equivalent of 1.6% a year, and that's below the historical trend of 2.6% a year. Now, this national number also misses the wide variation in how states were feeling or not feeling the recovery. Now, even though all states have rebounded from the recession, growth in some has been much faster than growth in others. Now, this slide shows state personal income growth since the recession began, and a few standout trends from both ends of the ranking. At the top, you can see that some of the fastest growing states are energy producers, such as North Dakota and Texas. For the country as a whole, 17 states saw their total personal income grow faster than that of the U.S. While personal income in all states is higher than their pre-recession level, expansions in some have lagged quite a bit compared to others. Now, at the bottom of this chart, you can see that the expansions of Mississippi, Illinois, and Connecticut, for example, have been just a fraction of those in North Dakota and Texas. And now you can also see the ranking for all 50 states on Fiscal 50. But so now things will look much different when you focus on the changes over the past year instead of growth since the start of the recession. Now we've added the green bars to this chart to show changes in state personal income just over the past year. Now look at North Dakota. You can see that its state personal income actually dropped over the past year, and that's quite a contrast from its #1 rank for the longer term. North Dakota wasn't alone in seeing a slowdown. Personal income fell in 18 states over the past year, and that's signaling a slowdown in these states' economic growth. Not only that, personal income in 45 states, as well as the U.S. as a whole, grew slower over the past year than it did since the start of the recession. Now, so what's been causing this slowdown? For the nation, lingering weakness in farming was the biggest drag over the year. For the 18 states with declines in personal income, some were hit by that same weakness in agriculture, and in others, the drops were energy related. So how is it that North Dakota is still #1 in growth since the start of the recession, even though its economy contracted over the past year? Now, Fiscal 50 provides a view that breaks apart the 10-year growth trend to show the ups and downs over the decade. For North Dakota, you can see that 2010 through 2012 were powerhouse years for the state, but its economy later turned, led by drops in oil prices. And Fiscal 50 lets you create this chart for each of the states so that you can see the underlying major economic trends. And now, let's shift gears a little bit and use Fiscal 50 to look at some issues that go beyond the recession. Because even after states overcome the effects of the last downturn, they may face other pressures that can shape budgets for years to come. Now, a major issue for a number of states is how to cope with an accumulation of unfunded public pension liabilities, unfunded healthcare costs for retired public employees, as well as debt. Now, each of those long-term challenges has different implications for states, but all still represent future claims on states' revenue. Now, rather than comparing dollars and liabilities, Fiscal 50 compares each of these obligations as a share of each state's personal income, and that factors in the size of each state's resources and allows for cross-state comparisons. So which of these 3 long-term obligations is the most formidable in your state? Is it unfunded pension costs, unfunded retiree healthcare costs, or debt? Now, if your state has a pension problem, rest assured that you are not alone. As this map shows, pensions, shown here in the light blue, were the largest obligation facing the greatest number of states. And in all, 39 states face more unfunded pension liabilities than either debt or unfunded retiree healthcare costs. In 2015, states collectively owed more than $1 trillion in unfunded pension liabilities. Now, what this measures is the shortfall between benefits promised to government workers and the savings available to meet those obligations. Now, in 6 states, in green, retiree healthcare was the largest unfunded obligation. In 5, in dark blue, it was debt. It's important to note that these 3 types of obligations are not created equal. Debt, for example, is a tool in financing infrastructure projects like new highways or bridges that can be enjoyed by future taxpayers. Retirement costs are different because pushing off those liabilities asks future taxpayers to cover the bill for services already rendered. Yet all share one important trait. They all are claims on future state revenue, and they have annual costs that can put pressure on state finances. Now, some states definitely have bigger challenges than others when it comes to these liabilities. New Jersey, at the top of the slide, had the largest total obligations relative to personal income in 2015, and just behind it were Alaska and Hawaii. Now, by the way, 2015 is the latest data that we have available at Pew for all 3 liabilities. What I'm showing you today is fresher than what you can see on the website currently. and we are getting ready to update the Fiscal 50 Interactive soon with this 2015 data. Now, getting back to New Jersey, in 2015, its 3 long-term obligations together were the equivalent of 48% of its state personal income. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, you have South Dakota, Nebraska, and Tennessee, which stand out for having the smallest obligations relative to their personal income. And Fiscal 50 allows you to see how your state ranks in terms of its total obligations, as well as for each of these categories. Now, for instance, New Jersey's pension liability, measured as a share of personal income, ranked largest in the country in 2015. Its unfunded retiree healthcare costs ranked second highest, and its debt obligations were 4th highest. Now, looking at what happened to these liabilities over time is also revealing. Now, here's the 50-state total for each of these obligations. First, notice the top line in light blue. This represents unfunded pension costs. The gap that you'll see in that pension line reflects that the accounting rules for estimating state pension liabilities changed in 2014. Now, this shows us, in addition to unfunded pension costs being the most dominant liability in a majority of states, as we just saw on the map, they were also the largest. Unfunded pension costs were equivalent to 7% of 50-state personal income, versus just 4.1% for retiree healthcare and 3.3% for debt. Additionally, unfunded pension liabilities also grew the most over the past decade. Now, in recent years, many states have taken steps to address their unfunded pension liabilities, though not every state has, and many still have more work to do. Now, compare pension liabilities with the retiree healthcare liabilities in that middle green line. The line only starts at 2010 because that is when Pew started collecting this data, which was a couple years after states themselves first began reporting these liabilities. Now, retiree healthcare liabilities are the second largest obligation, and yet states have relatively little set aside. And that's because most states pay for retiree healthcare benefits on a pay-as-you-go basis, paying for costs as they occur rather than pre-funding liabilities as they do for pensions. Now, as a result, only a dozen states have saved even 1/5 of what they are estimated to need to meet their promises to public workers, and many have set aside 0. So particularly as the baby boomer generation retires and start claiming their healthcare benefits, this long-term obligation will need attention. And now Jess will talk about another fixed cost that presents a pressing budget obligation, that is Medicaid spending.
Thanks, Joe. Another source of rising pressure on states' budgets, as Joe was saying, is spending on Medicaid, the joint state-federal health insurance program for low-income Americans. This indicator shows the share of their own money that states spend on Medicaid. It does that by looking at state Medicaid spending, that is just states' portion of Medicaid spending, excluding the federal match, as a proportion of own source revenue. And own source revenue is all revenue generated by states, including revenue collected from local governments. Here, you have the 50-state view, showing the percentage of their own money states altogether spent on Medicaid since fiscal year 2000. As you can see over there at the right-hand side of the graph, Medicaid is taking up a greater share of each state-generated dollar than it did at the start of this century at the far left, and more than it did before the Great Recession, which is shown in that gray shading there in the middle. In 2015, states overall spent 17 cents of every state-generated revenue dollar on Medicaid. By comparison, in 2000, they spent about 12 cents. That's 4.5 cents more of each dollar for the 50-state share. This trend matters because when a greater share of each state-generated revenue dollar is spent on Medicaid, there's less money available to fund competing priorities, such as education or, say, transportation. Now, besides offering a national perspective, you can also compare states to each other over time. Here, we show Pennsylvania in orange and Utah in green, but when you use the interactive, you can choose any state to do this. Utah spent the smallest share of own source revenue on Medicaid in 2015, just over 6 cents. And since 2000, it has consistently spent less than 7 cents of every dollar on Medicaid. In contrast, Pennsylvania has consistently spent a larger share of its own source revenue on Medicaid compared to the nation as a whole. In fact, only 3 states spent a greater share than Pennsylvania: New York, Louisiana, and Rhode Island. Now, in the green shading on the graph, we've overlaid some important federal Medicaid actions to help assess effects on states' share of spending. After the Great Recession, even though more people qualified for Medicaid after losing jobs and income, federal stimulus dollars helped offset the extra costs for a time. So you don't see a jump in states' Medicaid spending until after the federal stimulus funds fully expire around 2011. Now, starting in January of 2014, states could choose to expand Medicaid coverage to previously ineligible adults under the Affordable Care Act, or the ACA. However, the federal government has picked up full cost of these newly eligible low-income adults through 2016, so the expansion has no direct impact on state spending during the time pictured here. Pennsylvania is a state that expanded its Medicaid program in January of 2015, and its Medicaid costs actually declined as a share of its revenue between 2014 and 2015. Utah has not expanded. States began picking up 5% of the cost of their expanded population in 2017, and this will gradually rise to 10% by 2020. These are the state costs of the ACA expansion that will eventually be captured in this indicator once the data becomes available. Now, this view ranks states based on the change in state-funded Medicaid spending as a proportion of own source revenue between 2000 and 2015. In other words, we calculate Medicaid's footprint on revenue in each year and then sort the states by the size of the difference. So for example, at the top of the chart, Louisiana's share increased the most since 2000. In 2000, Louisiana spent just over 10 cents of each state-generated dollar on Medicaid, and in 2015, it spent just over 23 cents of each dollar. That's an increase of about 13 cents. The next largest increases since the year 2000 were in Alaska, followed by California. And while the impact of Medicaid on state finances varies greatly, since 2000, nearly every state's share has increased. At the bottom of this chart, you can see that only 2 states, New York and North Dakota, spent a smaller slice of their own dollars on Medicaid in 2015 than in 2000. In both, Medicaid costs actually increased, but own source revenue grew by an even greater percentage. Looking ahead, the eventual possibility of lower federal support for Medicaid programs is complicating budget writing for the next fiscal year, as many of you probably know. If Congress follows through on ideas to cap or limit federal funding for Medicaid, beneficiaries could lose coverage unless state policymakers decide to cover the difference, and that would further pressure their finances. Finally, an overarching challenge for states is keeping revenue and expenses aligned over the long run, sometimes described as maintaining structural balance. Our fiscal balance indicator provides a 50-state look at how each state has performed on this score. It compares total revenue to total spending from fiscal 2002 to 2016 and determines which states amassed insufficient revenue over that period to cover expenses. In this view, states whose revenue covered their expenses are colored in blue, while states where revenue came up short of expenses are in orange. Between 2002 and 2016, most all states amassed sufficient revenue to cover their expenses. In this view, though, we only show 3 of the 39 states that accumulated surpluses over the past 15 years, those with the largest. These are those long blue bars you see at the bottom of your screen. If you go to our website, you can see the full view of all the states. Here, you only see Alaska, Wyoming, and North Dakota. These are resource-rich states that tend to accumulate large revenue surpluses acquired in boom years to help cushion shortfalls when oil or, say, mining revenues decline. But 11 states, represented by those orange bars, have accumulated a deficit or a negative fiscal balance. This means that they failed to take in enough revenue over those 15 years to cover the full expenses they incurred and probably had to push off some of those costs to future taxpayers. This can be an indication of a more serious structural deficit. And you can see all this information in the interactive chart on our website, which allows you to sort the states based on fiscal balance ranking or alphabetically. The next view digs below top-line aggregate information to show what happened year by year. You can see separate revenue and expenses for each state, which makes it easy to see how each changed from year to year. Surpluses are highlighted with blue shading, and deficits are highlighted with orange. This slide shows New Jersey, which is one of the 11 states with a negative fiscal balance. New Jersey only contains orange shading because it actually carried a deficit every year for the past 15 years. You guys know your states best, so we encourage you to examine these year-by-year accountings with an eye towards the economic or policy factors that might have influenced them, and see if any applicable lessons can be drawn.
Well, thanks for that, Jess. This is Ruth again. Before we get into the Q&A, here's a quick review of other Fiscal 50 indicators. This view of our homepage shows the indicators in bold that I will very briefly highlight. We measure tax revenue volatility, how much your state's tax revenue and its major streams typically swing from year to year. Understanding your state's tax revenue volatility can help with budget management. Also, we track the federal share of your state's revenue. Nationally, federal dollars make up almost a third of state revenue, which is why decisions on federal funding matter a great deal to states. On the spending side, we look at how outlays compare to states' economies over time. And finally, we also study employment among adults in their prime working years as a way to help gauge states' comeback from the recession. What we found is that while the national labor market has been improving, it still isn't back to where it was before the recession began. We will selectively be adding additional indicators to Fiscal 50. One in progress will measure how states' populations have changed over time. Demographics are a factor in the growth of states' economies and government finances. Now that we've toured through Fiscal 50's indicators, let's talk about how you can find the interactive and use it for your own work. There are two easy ways to get to Fiscal 50. First, you can bookmark the URL, which is pewtrust.org/fiscal50, as you see on the slide. Also, you can Google the site. To keep up with our fresh data, indicator, and analysis updates, we can send you email alerts. If you would like an email alert when Fiscal 50 updates its data, you can sign up for our newsletter with the contact information for Sarah Lazica that you see on the slide. In a few minutes, we'll move on to the Q&A session. During the Q&A session, we'll show you how to use the interactive and find our downloadable data and graphics. And please keep in mind that we're happy for you to share our findings. You can pick up graphics or a screenshot of Fiscal 50 in memos, presentations, or other documents with attribution to the Pew Charitable Trusts. You can also quote our analysis and adapt it to your state. Also, all of our indicator data is downloadable. We'll show you how to find it in a few minutes. If you do plan to use our graphics for commercial purposes, please contact us first. And now Sarah will run our Q&A session.
Great, thanks, Ruth. So now we are ready to take your questions. Just a reminder, you can submit a question by clicking on the control panel on the right side of your screen. And once you do so, enter your query in the questions box. So while we're waiting for questions to roll in, Ruth, could you give us a quick tour of the interactive?
Yes, I can, Sarah. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to use our interactive. You'll learn how to search for your state and compare it to others in national benchmarks. I'm also going to show you how to find our downloadable materials, the data, graphics, and analyses. Right now, we're already on Fiscal 50's site. If you had to get here from, say, Google, all you would do is go to the address bar and type Pew Trusts. Can I spell it? We'll see. All right, pewtrust.org/fiscal50. 50. And there we go. Here we are. Now we're on the home page. Let's click on reserves and balances. So if you scroll down a little bit, you can find reserves and balances and click. This indicator tells you how many days your state's government could operate based on its rainy day funds and total balances. We have a fair number of registrants today from Colorado and Minnesota. So let's check out their data. To see how your state's total balances are doing, choose your state from the drop-down menu on the right. So here we go. Let's choose Colorado. Let's choose Minnesota. Dropping down, I'm choosing. All right. You can also decide whether to show the 50-state median. Right now, the 50-state median is selected. If I click on this box, I unselect it, but let's show it. It's very interesting. One really interesting component of this view is that you can actually hover over each of the lines and see all the data for a particular point in time. So right now, I'm hovering over Minnesota for fiscal 2016, and I see that it has 56.2 days of operating costs. Now, if we want, we can also look at the latest rankings. So we'll go over and click on that. And this view will show us just the balances in rainy day funds for fiscal 2017. You can sort by ranking, and that just is a numerical sort, or you can do it alphabetically. If we sort alphabetically, we can find, again, Colorado's information. And if we hover over it, we see in fiscal 2017, Colorado had 21.5 days worth. Importantly, for both of these major views, you can also choose between looking at total balances or just rainy day funds. So right now we're looking at latest rankings. If you go just a little bit below, you see total balances, which we're looking at right now. If you click over, now we're looking just at rainy day funds. And you can do the same thing for compare state trends. Right now we're on only rainy day funds, but we could also click on total balances. If you want to share the images you create with the interactive, simply take a screenshot and your chart is ready to go. Also on this page, you can read the analysis that our researchers refresh and write for each update. For this update, they found state rainy day funds grow even as total balances lag. Now let's say you want to use these images or data elsewhere. Scroll down to our Download Data tab, and you can click on the Excel spreadsheet link right here. You can also access our static graphics that are really pretty cool. Let's click on this top one. 26 states' rainy day funds surpassed pre-recession levels. You can use this graphic in a tweet. You can use an email, however you think it would work best for you. Finally, if you want to see a printable version of the analysis, go back to our main window for the analysis, scroll all the way down, and you'll find a handy link right here for the printable version. The printable version is very helpful in that if you find that you want to share this with colleagues, friends, family, you can just print it out. It also contains our static graphics, and this will produce a very nice, clean copy for you to share. Now with that, let's open up the floor to questions.
All right, great. We have a few questions coming in. First of all, what is the impact of the 2017 Tax Act to state revenues? Who wants to take that one? Barb?
Okay, I guess that'll fall to me. This is Barbara Shavitz speaking. Hello, everyone. Well, some of this is probably going to repeat things that you already know if you're close to the state budget situation at all. That's because the federal tax changes are expected to broaden the income tax base in a number of states, and that's going to result in state tax revenue increases in many of those states. That is, unless policymakers take action this year to reduce those increased revenues. Since in most states we're still in the middle of legislative sessions, we actually don't really know how this all is going to shake out. So the end result is going to be dependent on what these states decide to do about the extra revenue. So let me just tell you a little bit about what we do know, because we do watch this quarterly tax revenue as it comes in. The last data that we have is through the second quarter of 2017. We've just gotten a third quarter of 2017 because we have to wait until all 50 state data are available. From our count, just looking at what we're reading about and seeing state reports, we think that at least 23 states expect revenue increases as a result of the federal tax law, and there actually are about 3 that expect decreases. Mostly in all of these, it means there's still, though, a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen. One thing that I think is more certain is just that this increases the difficulty of revenue estimating over this amount of time, because there have been a couple things going on already. We saw at the end of 2017 how there was income shifting. A lot of people were paying their property tax bills early to try to take advantage of the continued deductibility before the SALT deduction expired. But at the same time, cutting the other way were people who were moving income into 2018 to take advantage of lower federal rates. So the income was moving both ways on that, and it's really hard to know how that is going to leaven out. What I guess I'd say is that when I'm thinking ahead to what tax revenue is going to look like, it's going to be very uncertain how this is all going to shake out in fiscal year 2018 and also fiscal year 2019.
Great, thanks. We have a couple questions coming in about sources. Can you talk a little bit more about where this data is sourced from, how the underlying information is gathered, and how the numbers are altered to fit into comparable categories?
Let me take the revenue. I'll take the revenue side. I think there are a couple of questions about this. Our tax revenue data is generated by the Census Department because we look at quarterly tax revenue. However, that is funneled through the Rockefeller Institute of Government, which makes changes to it to kind of fill in the blanks when states did not get their data in time, for example, to the Census Bureau. We use a number of different sources for our data. We're limited by the availability of 50 state data. So a lot of it comes through the federal government from different agencies. A little of it we collect on our own as well. We, for example, look at states' comprehensive annual financial reports, going back in time to look at our fiscal balance indicator, looking at revenue and expenses on an accrual basis. One of the things as you use Fiscal 50 is to think about the trends are really what is more important than the actual numbers, because in a lot of instances, these numbers are not going to match up with your general fund budgets. That's because most of these data sources are not looking at general fund data. The one that is comes directly from state budget officers to the National Association of State Budget Officers, and that's for rainy day funds and total balances. And so those should align with your own budget numbers. The others often take a larger look. Even tax revenue, for example, is not just general fund tax revenue, because in many states, some of their tax revenue is already shunted to other funds and never ends up in their general fund. So for us to give a more comparable sense of what the trends are among states, we are trying to use the data that has been normalized so that it's at least as apples to apples as we can get it. So as I said, I think the trends should line up, but the budget numbers are not going to line up with this data. Did we have another question about the rainy day fund?
Yeah, we do. Let's see. Question about rainy day fund. Does the calculation of rainy day fund balance exclude other unencumbered fund balances? Does this represent total available funds?
Sure, I could take that one. Ruth, could you go back to the interactive and show us where we can find information on sources and methodology for our rainy day fund indicator?
I can, Danny.
Great. Yeah, so to answer your question, the Reserves and Balances Indicator uses data collected by the National Association of State Budget Officers, and that's through their Fiscal Survey of the States reports, which they put out twice a year. So they collect things like rainy day fund balances, revenue balances, And this includes what the state designates as a general fund ending balance, although the obligations on those balances will, of course, vary from state to state. So this question is kind of part of why our indicator allows you to view both a state's rainy day fund balance and its total balances, which includes those reported ending balances I just talked about. So what we're looking at with rainy day funds is what represents the things that states have purposely set aside to provide a cushion against the next downturn. And that's what we think makes them particularly useful when evaluating how prepared your state might be. But again, states vary in how they use their ending balances. So for those states whose ending balances are encumbered, the total balance may be a better way to analyze them. That said, states may have additional resources to soften downturns outside of these two main categories that we're looking at. So they might have other dedicated reserves outside of their general funds or rainy day accounts that are not specifically included in the figures that you'll see here in this indicator.
Great, thanks, Danny. Another question here about tax revenue. In the tax revenue portion, was any attempt made to adjust for policy changes like tax reductions or tax increases when showing the percentage changes from the recession period?
This is Barbie again. The data that we're using does not make adjustments for policy changes. What you have to think about, these are the outcomes of economic changes and policy changes on states' total tax revenue, and as we like to think about it, on states' total purchasing power. So therefore, the outcome of all of those factors on states' tax revenue. We have not found a good way year to year to be able to extract the estimated effects of tax policy changes across that many years in a way that we feel is responsible enough to be able to compare states. That said, though, we do have a methodology in our tax revenue volatility indicator in which we use the NCSL's tax actions reports to extract the percent change from new tax policy changes. The reason that we do it particularly in that one is because the goal of that indicator is to say, except for tax policy changes, what are the underlying factors that are driving swings in your tax revenue? So in that one, we do use the estimated tax changes that are coming through NCSL and extract those and then look at how much tax revenue changed despite those, without those policy changes in mind.
Great, thanks, Barb. Lastly, we've gotten a couple questions about using Fiscal 50 graphics and data. So just to reiterate, you all are more than welcome to use graphics or screenshots from Fiscal 50, always with attribution to the Pew Charitable Trusts. If you plan to use that information for commercial purposes, please reach out to us first. And with that, I think we are wrapping up our Q&A, and I'll turn it back to Savannah.
Thank you so much, Sarah. This brings us to the conclusion of this webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact NCSL. Our contact information is listed on the screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be archived on the NCSL website. Also, viewers will have the option to fill out a survey with their thoughts at the end of the webinar. We would very much appreciate your feedback. And lastly, thank you very much for your interest and participation today.